Welcome back, everyone. In the last video, we took a look at what files and folders got built for us by Create React App, and inside of package.json, we took a look at our start script. We took a look at also the files related to setting up the initial project, which is the index.js file and the index.html file, and how React DOM at a high level helps us render out our application. In this video, we are going to deep dive into the 3 remaining scripts inside of React. And what we're going to do as well is we will take a look at some of these other files and how they relate to these scripts. So diving into the next one, which is build. What is build? So right now, what I want you to understand is that when we ran script start, this is just taking our application code and pushing it directly through our local port of 3000, so on our computer, and our browser is just accessing it directly. It doesn't have to go through our network, which is our Wi-Fi or internet connection or anything like that, in order to get the related files in order to run our application. It doesn't need to. It's all local on our computer. So this is incredibly efficient and fast. We don't even need to think about optimizing it at all. But when we're actually hosting our application live somewhere so that anybody can access our website, they need to leverage their internet connection. And as we know, internet connection varies and it can be very slow. So what needs to happen is our code needs to be much more optimized so that it's as small and efficiently served as possible. And that's really what this build step does. So going back to our terminal, if we do something like we call yarn or npm, whichever one you prefer once again, and we call build, what will happen is that React scripts will actually generate an optimal build for us, an optimal build folder. And what this is doing is it is taking all of this code that we have. So all of these separate files and all of these different JavaScript and CSS files. And what it'll do is it'll actually group it all into one file for each related JS, CSS, index.html, and it will make it as optimal as possible. And it will put it all inside of a new folder right here called build. So if you go into this, what you'll see is that there's our index.html file again. But inside of here, you see that it's very condensed. And what you'll notice is that in here is all of the code related to our application. You'll see that there's all this like really funky looking JavaScript code, and it's really tight, and it's just using these very reduced variable names. And the reason for this is because it's trying to create the most optimal low memory version of our application as possible. So that's really what's happening here. It's taking all of these files that we have, all these potential JavaScript files that we're going to write throughout this course, and it's just condensing it down into the fastest version that can be sent over an internet connection for a browser to consume. So that's really all this build is doing for us. So going back to our package.json, we want to look at test. So testing we're going to cover extensively later in the course. At a high level, all you need to know is that tests are just ways for us to make sure that the code that we write for our React application does what we expect it to. Inside, you'll see that there is a app.test file. Don't look at the content for now. This is not as important right now. But essentially what it is that it's a test file that is trying to test something in specific. In this particular case, it's testing the app.js file. We haven't looked at these yet, but all you need to know at a high level is that this test is related to this file. And it's just making sure that this file's code does what we expect it to. So when you run React scripts test, it's going to try and test your code. And it'll tell you whether or not your code is doing what you expect it to do according to the test. If it doesn't, it will break and fail. And again, we're going to talk about testing much later. I don't want to bog you down into the details of it right now, but just understand that's what this does. Now, finally, let's talk about eject. To talk about eject, we have to get a deeper understanding of actually what happens in the build. So one thing I want you to think about is that when it comes to a browser, right now I'm using Chrome, but there's actually numerous different browsers. There's Safari, there is Internet Explorer, there's Edge, there's Opera, there's probably some other browsers. Each browser is implemented a little differently. That's why there are different browsers. What this means is that they consume the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files in their own way under the hood. This code that we're writing, which is React code, is not necessarily code that every browser can understand. A lot of the times, this is some interesting, funky syntax, which we'll deep dive into once we go throughout the course, that is already kind of hard for us to understand. We have to understand how React works in order to write this code. The browser definitely doesn't understand. Oftentimes, the browser understands an older version of JavaScript syntax only. So what's happening is that in this build process, there is actually two libraries being used, or two packages, two helpers, essentially. One is called Babel, and the other is called Webpack. What Babel does is it takes all of this React code that we've written, all this React funky JavaScript, and it actually condenses it down into this JavaScript that these browsers can understand. If you look at it, it's very basic JavaScript, very, very old school JavaScript. None of the new syntax that you and I are used to writing with. So the reason for this is because, again, all of these browsers, all these different browsers can understand probably a very basic version of JavaScript. And Babel is just making sure that all of our code gets built into a version that can be understood by these browsers. So I mentioned there were two main helpers. There's Babel and there's Webpack. What is Webpack? Well, Webpack is actually something that makes our code a little bit more efficient. So inside of here, this index.html, there is some JavaScript that is focused on actually pulling the primary JavaScript files. So inside of the static folder inside of build, you'll see there's a CSS folder, there's a JS folder. Inside of this JS folder is all the different chunks. You'll notice that they all end in this .chunk. A chunk is essentially a contained portion of JavaScript code that is working together to actually represent a part of our application. What it's doing is that Webpack is saying, hey, sometimes, let's say our application, we wrote a massive, massive web page. There's a lot of different JavaScript files that even when reduced can only be reduced so far. So what Webpack says is, oh, okay, actually, you know what? Let me break these into chunks so that when the user is trying to access the homepage, he just gets the JavaScript related to the homepage. If he wants to navigate to like another page, then I'm going to turn that other page into a new chunk and then send it to them when they need it. So Webpack is essentially modularizing our code. Module being a chunk. That's a good way to think about it. So that's really what Webpack does, is it's saying, oh, your JavaScript's really big. I'm going to make sure that I optimize it and break it into the self-contained portions of it so that when the user is trying to access one part of it, it only gets the relevant JavaScript for that part. It's not going to get all of it. And that's all Webpack is doing. So essentially, what Build is doing is it's leveraging Babel and Webpack in order for it to properly optimize for these browsers as well as for the speed so that we send down all the appropriate chunks when the user needs them. That's what it's doing. So how does this relate to what I was talking about, which is eject? Well, again, Webpack and Babel are tools. That means that you can modify them so that they follow some specific rules that you want. Create React App is just saying, hey, I've already optimized that for you. I'm optimizing telling Babel and telling Webpack what to do. If you want to modify it for your project needs and concerns, you can eject. And what that will do is it will spit out the files that are related to actually showing you what Babel and Webpack do. So you can modify them to do what you want. And actually, Andre is going to break that down in the next video and actually tell you why you shouldn't eject, because honestly, Facebook's a really optimized team for this kind of stuff, and they've written extensively and they've tested extensively the best configuration for Webpack and Babel for most cases. Chances are you might actually work on a project that does need you to eject because of some funky work requirement based on your project. But most of the time, especially for us learning React, we definitely don't need to eject. But that's really what's happening here. Now, before we break down some of the core portions of the actual React code, I want to take a look at a couple other of the more minor files that we got generated. There is this setup tests.js, which is related to the actual tests themselves. It's just a file that really just imports the specific testing library. And that testing library will dive deeper later, so don't worry about this one. Inside of our public, there is a favicon. So this favicon is really just this icon right here in the tab of your browser. That's just what that icon is. We also get these logos of these different sizes. And these logos are more so related to this manifest.json file. The manifest.json file is a way for us to actually be progressive web app compliant. And all this means, progressive web app, is that some people want to be able to download your web application onto their desktop so that they can access it offline. It's essentially a way for somebody to use your application, not through the browser. So essentially, with these logos, you can create this little icon of your choice, which is what these logos will be, inside of this contained progressive web app application that they download from the website onto their desktop. And then that logo is what they double click to actually open your progressive web app version of your website. If that seems confusing, don't worry. We're going to go through how that all works later, much later in the course. But just understand that this is doing that for us. And then there's also this robots.txt file. And this file is just telling essentially web scrapers, which is SEO related. So like Google, for example, when they determine whether they need to rank your website higher or lower, it crawls your website with their own kind of like code crawlers. And this robots.txt is just a way to help explain what that is. This one you don't have to really worry about as far as your building web application goes, but just understand that it's generated for you. So now that we understand the majority of some of the lesser important files that are all generated for us, we are going to dive into what the main bulk of the actual code created for us by Create React App and related to React code is related. And we're going to do that in the next video. So I'll see you in the next video.